Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for introducing us. And I've had the pleasure of working with FEFO in several areas, including their health and safety index, also their environment, health and safety leadership workshops, as well as some auditing and helping with gap analysis and areas of auditing such as ISO. So done quite a bit of work with FEFO and really enjoy working with the team, and looking forward to going through this with you all today. So today's agenda, we'll be focusing on the first few slides, a recap on what we've already looked at over the previous weeks. We'll then be going into setting clear expectations, building capability, pitfalls and leading practices. As I said, we look forward to going through that with all of you.
Thanks, Caitlin. So a bit of a recap from webinars 1 and 2. Some of the things that we try and promote and encourage organisations to do before they embark on a critical control management program is to really understand where they're at today and where they want to be. So not every organisation is different. A Rio Tinto or a BHP, have a huge amount of resources, capability and expertise, which could be very different to some smaller organisations who are built differently. So it's definitely not a one size fits all. We also provide different methods to measure current performance around critical control management. We do have an online assessment organisations can tap into, as well as a risk critical control workbook, which enables organisations a bit of a step-by-step guide on how to both identify major unwanted events, critical controls, and some of the things that we'll be talking about today. So setting expectations and performance standards. So if we just take a step back and look at the bigger picture, setting expectations is one of the fundamental ingredients to building high-performing cultures and operating effectively. On the screen, we've got a dashboard of the health and safety index results. And you can see there for this particular example, setting clear expectations, one of the dimensions was a little bit lower scoring compared to some other areas. As we start talking about setting expectations or performance standards around critical control management, it's important to understand that you don't necessarily need a sophisticated system to set expectations. Setting expectations could vary from just a basic, really effective conversation around role expectations. It could be access to process or clear and easy to use systems. The dot points we have here around setting expectations, be it around having effective conversations as a senior leader, or linking job demands, or linking between the organisation and the job activity, are some basic questions we've got in the health and safety index. And it relates very much into what we're talking today around setting expectations and outlining performance standards. So some examples of performance standards. On the screen, we've got a bit of a sample of what our workbook looks like, and it might help share some learning today for people on the call. A lot of organisations who are involved in high-risk work generally have a safe work method statement or something similar around setting expectations on controls. So that's very much fundamental, basic legal compliance for many organisations, all the way through to leading practices around setting some quite detailed performance criteria on how to verify a critical control. So we'll be going through those today, just to give people a bit of an idea of the differences between various ways to set expectations and critical control performance standards. So performance criteria. If the listeners refer back to some of our advice around the ICMM guideline for critical control management, they outline some really good practical examples around setting some performance criteria. As organisations start to do this, there are lots of different examples. So here's what we call a level 4 and a level 5 example of setting performance standards. So the first unwanted event really outlines a few critical controls, such as installing RCDs or residual current devices as a critical control to help prevent some sort of electric shock or electrocution, and fire detection is often a really good critical control to prevent fire. Some options organisations have, they can have some performance criteria as it relates to the unwanted event at a broader level. And that criteria could be, for example, with RCDs, the trip and the measurements in and around, or how do we verify that the RCD is actually working? And that the method of verification could be an ejection test and the supporting frequency. Some other examples could be testing and tagging. So on construction sites, the frequency could be a little bit different. But again, the critical control around having that RCD in place, and then some basic criteria around what, how, and when the critical control could be verified. If we take that to another level, level 5, and some of these examples are outlined in the ICMM guideline, we've just created a bit of a framework on how organisations can apply it. If we look at fire detection as a critical control, there's various ways we can break that down into various performance parameters, ranging from functionality all the way through to redundancy. One mistake organisations often make is they confuse dependency with independence. So it is best practice to have your critical controls independent of each other. Otherwise, it's like a house of cards or a set of dominoes. If one goes down, the rest go down. Dependency often is, what are some of those enablers or other things that the organisation needs to rely on to make that critical control actually effective? So a good example could be systems or training, etc., that would support that RCD. The example around fire detection, a redundancy example could be something as simple as a backup power supply if the current fire detection system were to fail. So as you can see, there's lots of different ways you can skin a cat. It's fair to say that performance standards are probably one of the more complex and arguably one of the most confused areas around critical control management. So it's really clear from the outset that you really want to understand where you play. So if you want something relatively simple, something easy for the organisation to use, particularly if you're starting out, we generally recommend to start around the level 2 or level 3 rather than sort of get into this level of detail. So Caitlin, over to you in terms of setting roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So with this particular slide here, it's really highlighting that everyone plays a role in critical control management. So at the top of that triangle there, under govern and design, and we do have the two, swim lanes either side of that, whether it's operations or health and safety personnel. But at the very top, particularly looking at something like setting standards, it's really that senior leadership that outline or approve what those standards are and what are the thresholds that we're going to work under there. We then move down into that second layer around management. So management then lead that critical control program throughout their operational area. And as a health and safety personnel, we help facilitate things such as, bow tie workshops to make sure that, the right people are engaged and we are addressing those. We then work into that third layer, which is manage and coach. So as health and safety personnel, making sure that we're coaching people within the role for critical control management, and how they do that. We're assisting with things such as skills, the quality in which we do that, making sure that they understand the checklists, and the operations team at that level ensuring that it's done in their area as well. And down the bottom in terms of implementing and supporting, so really ensuring that that everyone is playing a role in ensuring that those particular areas are implemented. And again, both parties, operational and health and safety personnel supporting in that area. I also just want to touch base on with Mark going through that level 4 and 5, and just from personal experience, really the first level 1 to 3 is something that I've heavily been involved in, and cannot I guess, reinforce that having those standards in place really play a critical role to ensure that those expectations and people's role is defined in that as well. And then where required, that unwanted event moves into more detail, such as level 4 and 5. So just wanted to sort of just give a bit of, I guess, experience in that area there too.
Thanks, Caitlin. So in terms of responsibilities, Caitlin, you've had a fair bit of involvement in rolling out critical control management programs. Where do you see some of the confusion lying, particularly as you start to create ownership around what needs to be focused on, whether it be a high frequency event or a high potential event? Have you had much experience in role confusion and confusion around what people need to do?
Yeah, definitely. So one that stood out to me is when you begin to roll out your critical control program, you often ask employees, could you tell me what the critical risks or what are the high potential risks for your area? And one thing that stood out to me is that a lot of employees say, oh, manual handling, or we injure our hands and fingers, so a lot of cuts on hands and fingers. And I really find that understanding or what the definition of a high potential is in terms of that catastrophic event is not necessarily understood for employees and managers. They tend to really focus on high frequency and ones that occur a lot. So there has to be a lot of education around what does a high potential look like, what is a high frequency, and not taking away from injuries such as manual handling, but just making sure that people know what the big ticket items are and why it is so important or so critical that controls are in place there to prevent a catastrophic event. But yeah, it's definitely stood out to me that people don't tend to understand what the critical risks or the high potentials are for their program. And there are things, or they are things that we work really hard on so that people know what the top 5 are. And more importantly, they know how to manage those.
That's a really good point, Caitlin. And for those that missed our first webinar where we spoke about identifying materially unwanted events, it's probably worth just reflecting on that and looking at that webinar as you start to embark on setting roles as we're speaking about today. Again, some examples on the screen here, comparing what a basic level 1 or 2 might look like compared to a level 4 or 5 is, a lot of organisations do have safe work method statements in place to help manage high risk work. What often organisations forget is not only ensuring that the safe work method statement is fundamentally focused on high risk activity, like Caitlin said, but also being really clear on what are the critical controls and keeping those front of mind for the end user. They can get lost in the forest if not careful. So really trying to highlight and prioritise those often is really valuable. Working through to leading practice, and look, this is straight out of the ICMM guidelines. So it's a really good example of how ownership can be created at different levels of the organisation, from a senior manager through to supervisor, and what role they may have to play in identifying, confirming unwanted events, critical controls, and the verification process. Breaking that ownership down into some specific activities, again, it's just going to another level of detail, which some organisations find really useful, particularly if it's a controlled environment, like a manufacturing site or a construction site that's relatively stable. Caitlin, we've worked a fair bit into the services industry, and it's fair to say that every day is different. So going to this level of detail is somewhat challenging. Caitlin, from your example, going into the level of detail around what we've said here, do you see that as a practical way of being able to implement a critical control management program in the services industry?
Yeah, look, I think it definitely helps with people understanding what their role is in the overall program and having some guidance on that. But do agree with you in that if the environment changes daily, and in some industries they could be at a different site every single day, the role can change. So some clarification around that may be needed, but it does help. I find that it does help if people know what their role is within the program, and what the role is in terms of flexibility if needed.
Yeah, great. That comes back to some of those principles around high reliability. It's just trying to build in a bit of flexibility in there and tailoring it to your organisational need. So after really understanding and setting clear expectations on what's important, what the critical controls are, and how they're actually verified, it's also a great opportunity for organisations to build the right capability around that as part of their critical control management program. So often organisations revert straight to training, formal training. Capability obviously is much broader than just training and much broader than just people. Often there's plant and equipment, processes, systems, the work environment and place in which organisations operate all need to be considered in terms of setting the organisation up for success. We've also got here a reference to the 70-20-10 model. So Caitlin, from your example, have you applied the 70-20-10 principles, or at least have some sort of stories or examples where you think that may or may not work?
Yeah, look, definitely applied all of those. So sometimes in the past have just done formal training where people go in, they're in a classroom type environment, undertake the training and then walk out. And I find that one there is probably being the most ineffective in terms of engaging that workforce with the program that you are rolling out, just because it doesn't have that practical application. So where success is with training, from my experience, is when you do have some of that formal, but you also, out on the job working alongside these people whilst they're doing their activities, such as an operational activity, so you're understanding what their demands are and how they apply, particularly that training to that area. And then following it up with some coaching, just to ensure that the quality, is there, they're doing them effectively, coaching them on any, strengths and recognising those, as well as any improvement areas, and also that accountability piece with that coaching post that training. So definitely had a play in all of those, and find that combination of the 70-20-10 does work most effectively if you're trying to upskill, build that capability, and then sustain that, as well as that accountability piece, as I mentioned.
Yeah, great. And in terms of identifying what those capability requirements are for people, it's often good to stop and reflect on what are the requirements of the program itself, and who needs to be aware of how it's pulled together and the right competencies to do that. And also boots on the ground verification activity around the critical control mechanisms in the field. So if we now just go through some critical control common pitfalls and leading practices around performance standards. Fundamentally, if you don't identify the material unwanted event or the critical control correctly in the first place, well, the performance standards are doomed to fail. So again, first principles in webinars 1 and 2, building the right capability and getting it right to begin with is really important. Setting the bar too high, so that principle that we spoke around from level 1 through to 5, we often say start small, test, learn. If you fail and learn, that's fine. Aim for improvement and then build on that in a staged approach, rather than trying to bite off too much too early. The other pitfall, really, as you start to pull together performance criteria, if that's something that you intend on doing, it's just being really clear, using the SMART principles and making sure that they're very specific and measurable, and more importantly, verifiable. So what you want to be able to do is actually have something that people can use in the field, rather than it just being an academic exercise on theory or some sort of system. Overdependence on critical controls. So I spoke very briefly around having some sort of level of independence between the critical controls and ensuring performance standards support that. So if one fails, all the rest don't fail together. And lastly, jumping into solution mode too quickly. So really being clear on what the capability requirements are before sort of jumping into any sort of solution mode or trying to solve the problem too early. From your experience, Caitlin, do any of those pitfalls or leading practices resonate with your experience?
Yeah, particularly the third one around vague performance criteria, or it's grey or open for interpretation. So that's one that's definitely questioned, or you go out on site to verify controls and you see different levels of standard based on that interpretation. So making sure that they're really clear suggests that they're trialed beforehand, and any potential for people to interpret them is consistent across that audience there.
Yeah, great. And often it's a bit of a trade-off. If you're trying to develop a very simple critical control management program, and you aren't necessarily going into that level of detail and specifics, sometimes there needs to be a level of pragmatism around how you verify that things are effective.
I have that one pop up a lot with working at heights. Specifically, what height do you need to have permits? What height do you need to have, fall vest equipment? Lots of things around that. And do you measure the height from your feet? So lots of things and lots of quirky questions around that one. And that's one that I've just been working through at the moment as a challenge, actually.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, look, thanks, Caitlin. Over to you, Sarah. We've got a poll here if you wouldn't mind getting that started.
I'm just launching that poll. Okay.
So the question today is, what topics would benefit your organisation? Hopefully you can select more than one. So the topics range today from defining responsibilities around the critical control management program, for those broader roles in the program itself, some specific responsibilities around critical controls and ownership on critical controls, performance criteria for each of the critical controls or unwanted events, defining capability, and lastly, delivering on that capability. Sarah, you've also got another option there too, if people want to use the chat.
Yeah, with a little typo in the end there, so ignore that.
That's my fault, Sarah, for getting it to poll 2 so late.
Yeah. Well, there's a clear winner here. I'll just wait a few more seconds if it is a competition. Okay. There you go.
Yeah, look, you're right. You're right there, Sarah. 83% performance criteria for critical controls. So, as I mentioned, it is one of the more misunderstood areas and more complex areas around critical control management. And again, it's not something that you necessarily need to do right away. But certainly can add lots of value if you get it right. So, thank you, Sarah. Very good. So just looking at the time, we've got 5 minutes. We'll try and allow a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. A bit of feedback that we've had over the last few webinars is, how do I deploy safety software around critical control management? So we always reinforce to get your requirements right first. So as mentioned within this webinar, setting those performance standards and getting the process up right first is absolutely critical for jumping into solution mode. So we use a number of different ways to help organisations do that through either facilitated workshops, the workbook we've made reference to, and other means to really get the foundational process right first before getting too far down the path of trying to configure any sort of systems or select a system to support this. It's also probably worth adding too that as you start to grow and mature, having some sort of safety software is certainly really valuable. So I'm starting to see some chats come through the webinar there, Sarah. So
well, that was me.
All right.
I'm sharing the link for the next week's webinar, so the rest of the series. So
very good. Well, look, that times well with the slide we've got at the moment. So yeah, as mentioned already, this is a 6-part series. This is 3 of 6. We've already had a chat to both Terry and Adam, and next week Beck's coming on board to talk about a little bit more on her experience on actually verifying critical controls in the field and evaluating the broader critical control management program.
Okay, there's a question for you, or Caitlin. Peter asks, this is great advice, but how do you get this information / practice into senior management daily business?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you really need, and I hate using the word journey, but you really need to take your senior management on the journey in terms of why we're putting in place things such as performance standards. So it's around making sure that particularly those unwanted events or catastrophic events are prevented, and really having them understand the context of that. You know, personally for me, that includes talking about, you know, we want to prevent a fatality, we want to prevent reputational damage, we don't want to be in the media, we don't want the regulator, you know, there, and we want to keep, you know, most importantly, keep our employees safe. So really having them understand how, once we outline that performance criteria, we put a program in, which I find is quite an easy program to understand in terms of control management, how we can prevent that and protect our people, the business, and them. It's something where you really have to get involved. You know, ask them what is keeping them awake at night, or what would keep you awake at night, and what would you do in these circumstances to really try and get senior management buy-in. And I found that in my experience, once you go through that, we're going to focus on, you know, the real big ticket items, and they understand the reason why due to the consequences, they're mostly on board, as well as involving them in things such as the bow tie, and they get a really good understanding of why we're doing it there as well.
We've also got another question here, Sarah. Peter Harris, or is this the same question? Getting advice from senior management. Okay, same question.
Yeah.
Good. So, Caitlin, I recall working together and providing some real life examples of things going wrong, be it in your own organisation or externally, often helps too. The
other one that's been quite good is, you know, a mock court on around, you know, what can happen, and also having senior managers own, you know, things such as a performance standard. So we might facilitate, coordinate the workshops to identify what the criteria is, but really engaging them in that, you know, let's go through this together. Let's make sure, you know, it's achievable. They understand the reason why, and, you know, they have the sign off there and the ownership as well.
And depending on the maturity of the organisation, certainly drivers around this ties in nicely with driving high performance and the right sort of behaviours. Organisations usually want to try and strive towards in terms of getting things right for it being a moral obligation, and tying in with the values of the business too.
Just one other thing on that, it's a question that it's such an important thing in order to get your program up and running and being successful. But something like the Health and Safety Index, which we did with FEFO, it outlined where we sat on the index and also benchmarked us against you know, other companies and best practice. That's something that was a good driver for senior management on, you know, we're sitting here, how do we get into that best practice, and what can we do? And a bit of competitiveness there as well always helps.
So Sarah, it's hit 1 o'clock my time. Is there anything else we need to cover up before we call things to a close?
No, there's no more questions. So I think we're all good. People know that in the email today, they get your contact details if they want to ask any other questions. I'm just noting that in a lot of these webinars, we get the same sort of questions about convincing senior management all the time. So I'm thinking we might actually arrange next year a sort of panel-based webinar on that topic. So, but yes, so all good for now. Thank you, Caitlin. That was really excellent. And thank you, Mark. We'll catch you next week. And yeah, keep an eye on your inbox later today for the email for the recording and podcast if you want to share that with other people. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, bye.